My name is Bernard Sweeney. I'm joined with Declan Henry, and we're going to talk about trauma. We're going to talk about mental health and various other aspects related to the human mind, I guess, and the human mentality. Declan is living in Kent, England. I believe he was born in Sligo. Ballymote he lived. I went to New York for a little while. I was in England for a little while. I was born in Mayo and I moved to Sligo for a long time. So I'm going to let Declan explain exactly his skills and so on and so forth because I was going through them. And I swear to you, they go on forever. So I couldn't write them all down. But I'll let Declan, you can introduce yourself, my friend, and tell us a bit about yourself.
Hello, Bernard. Hello, Bernard. Yeah, hello, everybody. Nice to be on the podcast today. Yeah, what can I say, Bernard? Yeah, you're absolutely right. I was born in Ballymote in County Sligo. I went to school in Tubbercurry. And oh gosh, now I've lived in England quite a long time now, Bernard. I've been over here since, oh God, 1986. So to be quite honest with you, I've probably lived I have lived longer outside Ireland than I have lived in Ireland, if that makes sense. So,
Yeah.
but I had still, I've still retained my Irish roots. Obviously, all my family are still in Ireland. What else? And I hopefully you can detect an Irish accent here. I don't think I've developed too much of an English accent, so or at least over here, everybody knows that I'm Irish. But sometimes when I come to Ireland, they confuse me and they think that there's a bit of English in my accent. But I think I think I still sound pretty Irish. So yeah, I've been over here in England, Bernard, since 1986. I went to university here. I qualified as a social worker. I went to uni as a mature student, and I've been a social worker now. Well, I've been qualified about 21 years, but I kind of have been working in social work on and off since 1993. So yeah, I've quite a wealth of experience in social work and working with many disadvantaged groups. When I qualified as a social worker, I worked in forensic mental health for several years, and later in adult mental health in a community mental health team. So yeah, a lot of experience with working with both adults and young people with mental health issues. So yeah, so quite a significant experience in that field.
I remember when I was about 20 years ago when I first got involved with the traveller organisations. And I come from a traveller community, what I call a colonial label, because we had many labels like that: travellers, tinkers,
Mm.
itinerants, hedge people, woods people, bogs people. And it goes right back to the lands. But my first meeting with them was grand, sincere people, and lovely people, middle class, doing their best. It reminded me later in life when I came across a quote by Alan Watts. There was something like the monkey put the fish safely up in the tree from saving the fish from drowning. I'm paraphrasing that now, but it was something to that effect. It was like
Mm.
the road was paved with the road to hell was paved with well
With
intentions.
good intentions, indeed.
Yeah.
Yes.
So a bit like that it was in some ways because they were on a different frequency. But I remember meeting them and they got on well with them. And then I met more, and then I met more and more and more. And then it started to dawn on me that these people are quite systematic in their thinking. You would start to pick traits out of them. A bit like when you see guards or army people, they carry them habits with them for quite a while. It's programmed into them.
Well,
I
yeah,
got
they
that
become quite institutionalized, really.
exactly. On a fun note, sometimes I call them the middle rank people because they were the longest people in the systems.
Yes, that's.
but but I knew there was going to be conflict. I knew straight off there was going to be conflict because their intentions was for the travellers to be fixed. There were some kind of social broken group,
To
and
be
education.
civilized.
Yeah, to be
I think
civilized.
that was the word. That was the word that was used. That's what I've been picking up in my research for my current book. Yes. Yeah.
And again, that literally came from the English conquest. It was to civilize Ireland. Um,
Yes.
so it
Yes.
kind of
Yeah.
echoed throughout that. And it got me thinking, this is what put me into a kind of spiral because I fell out with the organization at a very early age in it. Because I said, look, do we keep getting us to do the things you want us to do? How is it possible we are the people we are if we keep doing the
Mm.
things you want us to do? So that kind of got me into thinking a lot about the whole settled traveller labels. because it's seen as a broken social group that needed to be fixed. And most of us, like we went through a lot of trauma, particularly my own family, particularly in other traveller families. And now later in life, when I know the history, you would say the whole island has gone through a lot of trauma and has never really dealt with it, never looked into it. But I knew at some stage back then that I was destined to meet a psychiatrist.
No, you're absolutely right. And I suppose what a lot of
Unavoidable.
people don't realize, Bernard, is that Ireland has a very, very dark history, and I suppose that really came across when one of the last books that I wrote. It was called Forbidden Fruit, and it kind of looked at life and Catholicism in contemporary Ireland. And this was kind of post-clerical sex abuse, and I think that really brought home to me for the first time, the dark history that Ireland has. And especially, the suppressed history around, sex and violence and all sorts of things that we've, managed to bury quite successfully until recent decades when things came to a head and really, the clerical sex abuse scandals were exposed and, all that misery, all that suffering that came with that. And I suppose it kind of exposed the misery and the suffering that was never came to the surface. People from previous generations. They brought horrific secrets to their grave with them.
That's absolutely correct. When you're saying that, because I come from the traveller community, if people are interested in that or not, connotations and biases might pop up in your head because you're seeing mostly negative things about travellers, and that's what's being fed to the public. Now, the last 100 years, we've gone through a excruciating trauma process, one of segregation, institutionalization, racism, discrimination, and it's endless. 1963 report by the government was again to settlise the travellers. And again, this was based on 1922, the settlement of Dublin, which was based on the 1600s by the English, called the Settlement of Ireland. So settled really rang home with me for quite some time, I can tell you. It dawned on me that the whole settled thing didn't matter. It was a label. There's no doubt about that, because we would have people with the same surnames as ourselves in the settled community, but yet there was two distinct cultures. Now, again, I'll just give you a bit of a detail, because now I know more than I had before. I spent a lifetime sort of seeking this out. And again, a bit like yourself, I think. And I think Sligo has something to do with it. But I had that innate curiosity. Because I was very young, I suspected that this world wasn't quite right. One, they thought we were broken, uneducated, unintelligent people. And yet we were come from a culture with chieftains, kings, warriors. Sounds fantasy and it sounds like something that's in the books, but this was my life. My father was our chieftain. My granduncle was our king. And this has echoed out among other clans. So a little bit later in life, you look back in history and you see all the same clan names, all the same patterns, all the same cultural traits. We'd been practicing things like Brehon law without even knowing we were practicing Brehon law. So we had all that kind of honor-based society. But in the 60s, then a government decided these people need to be fixed. I suspect now it's because Dublin itself was an English colony long before the English had arrived. And they themselves were Anglo-Saxons, Ireland's men, they called themselves. They would never call themselves Irish people. But it's an interesting one because earlier, I think it was off phone, or maybe it was on it, that you are the Irish man, but you're an Irish man in England, but slightly with an English accent in Ireland. And
yes.
What happened in Dublin, recorded history, was the English had come over and the people here would have been English themselves, but they had an Irish accent. So the English seen them as Irish and they started to lose their kind of identity. So I don't complicate this, but in say 1922, they never changed any of these colonial systems. And Trinity College was founded by Henry VIII, funded by his daughter Elizabeth. Maynooth College, and all these colleges were English. The acts, the laws, the policies, the landowning rights, the political setup were all constructs of English mentality. So I think this is where we came with a systematic fallout, because how Ireland was being treated by the English, how Catholics were treated by the Protestants, we were receiving the same treatments. Now, I mentioned earlier about the industrialization. 1963, segregated homes just for travellers, segregated schools just for travellers, segregated buses. Now, this is quite amazing. And then at one time I was in Dublin, I was told to F back to my own country. So I knew there was something not quite right with this statement.
No, yeah, you're absolutely right, Jay. It was this kind of dereliction of culture, and you're correct when you say, you know, when people talk about the 1960s, and I think there was a report that came out in '63. But you're absolutely right that it didn't really start in the '60s. I think it became highlighted in the '60s by that report. But you're right, that went way back into the '20s after Ireland became an independent, gained independence. But but I suppose it's notable the dereliction of culture in travellers since the '60s, because I suppose the quest, the aim was to absorb travellers into mainstream society, to make them settled. It was almost as if you needed to be rehabilitated. Rehabilitated from what? Because
I remember reading parts of that report, and they were shocked to find that travellers were. I mean, this is to tell you how shocking it is to be shocked at something. That people were shocked to find out that these people were educated and intelligent, and a lot of the travellers were mobile tradespeople, as we had been for centuries. So they were well-to-do travellers. So I do genuinely believe that if Ireland was to maintain its Irishness, that they were the normal people, they were the default Irish. Well, then they would have to explain who are these group of people, these clans, with various names that goes back hundreds, even thousands of years, who have been genetically, slightly genetic markers for 360 years, which would explain the Elizabethan conquest. So they come up and say, well, you also have genetic markers going back 1,000 years. And we thought that would make sense because we didn't marry just into anybody. Clans, even back then, would have married into stronger clans. You don't marry into people that's going to weaken that clanship. Sounds the way it is, but that's how it was.
But they were just made feel displaced in their own country. They were just really made feel that they didn't belong there. They had to feel that shame about their identity. And of course, that has caused enormous damage to both the travelling culture and really to the well-being and mental health of travellers, because it was that shame that you had to people were made to feel ashamed of their identity, to the powers that be, the traveling community, that was seen as a poverty, culture of poverty that had to be basically eliminated.
Well, again,
it really is a genocide.
Well, I call it now a psychological genocide because we're just literally dropping dead. But that whole go back a bit further and you'll see again, I don't mind dragging up history, but it's all connected, because once you're outside a settler mentality, our history isn't like the same way as settled people see history. They seem to see it as something that's well behind them, chopped up, timed, blocked, different variables, complex. Ours is a very living history. So there was definitely something there with the history. When you go back to the penal laws, which was pretty much the same thing, shaming people about their culture, their Irish language, their traditions, backward, wayward, despite the fact that it was the Irish monks that had actually taught the English how to read and write and put spaces between their words. We're far from these backward, unintelligent people, as of course the power of the be would have us portrayed. So to me, it's like one continuous event. It's like colonization, imperialism, and capitalism is still one event that's unchanged. But and it also goes for Irish people. That you find it on the Irish Gaelic people. They get excluded. They get treated pretty bad. Even today, comes arts or various other cultural things they'd like to do, they don't get them done. But they don't get as persecuted as travellers. Like we got apartheid systems and apartheid laws currently in Ireland used only against travellers. And these again are old English colonial laws. So I suppose now you're wondering why am I always going on about colonization?
You're pretty hot in it, Bernard, but I must say you do know your stuff. You know your stuff far better than I know. It's incredibly interesting listening to you because and it's incredibly difficult to actually to argue against your narrative, because what you're saying is probably very, very true. But I suppose from me as an author writing this book about travellers, about gypsies and travellers, travellers. I was only thinking, yesterday, the terrible damage that Irish people have done against their own. And when I say their own, I'm referring to travellers, because you are our own. You are part of who we are. We're both Irish. We both have that shared, bond together, and
Well, there would have been a time, no doubt about it. We would have been pretty much one mentality. But I take a bit of time for people to get their heads around this, and hopefully I can do this throughout with the arts. Is that we're not saying we're not Irish. We're not even saying we don't want to be connected or related to settled people. We're saying that the settled is a neurological colonial project sprouted off by a guy called Edmund Spenser, English poet, specifically advising the government how to beat the Irish out of the Irish and change their mentality into an English one. So over a period of time, we're talking about a psychological thing more than anything else. Now, on the island of Ireland, nobody knew who travellers were. Nobody knew where travellers came from, so on and so forth. So if they didn't know that on a small island and call themselves Irish, that in itself is a form of trauma or a denial that trauma ever had happened on the island. And again, it's not held against them.
Would you, and this is a question, Bernard, would you say, and again, with me doing this research, would you say that there was less emphasis or there was less focus on travellers up until the 1960s? That up until the 1960s, did travellers live a relatively relaxed life in Ireland? And I'm sure it would have been a difficult life, as it was for many settled people in that sense, up until the 60s. I don't think that there was
there's a wonderful history, Declan, between
for anyone.
Well, what we say with travellers. Remember, keep in mind that we're talking about Irish people in general, right? So the term traveller and settled wouldn't have existed all of the time. There would have been a time we could have been well as being one people. But yeah, I have a clip there of a video of my granduncle, rest his soul, and he was speaking, and he was getting angry about it. He was getting angry because he talked about the really good times and the nice times and the best of times with the settled people, that no doors were locked and go, and there was a great relationship. I've heard every traveller ever since them age talk about the pre-60s and how times were different. Now, the history, because I have a great friend in Sligo, also an archaeologist, and he was talking about even when the English were trying to break down the clans, it was the rural Ireland that was looking after the gentry, and they would provide them with food and welcome them to their homes. And the English were writing back to the English government, telling them that the gentry were fighting with the English when the English tried to take the farms of the Irish, and the Irish were feeding the gentry. So there was a relationship over and back that went on for centuries, right up to the point of 1960s. When we talk about the institutionalization of a people, we were othered. We had all our civil liberties stripped from us, institutionalized, and that was a projection. And from then, relationship had gone very sour. Fear, anxiety. And again, if you think about the industrial homes, one industrial home there, I think it was 46 traveller children were brought into it. And within a few years, only 2 survived and 44 were dead. Others that came out were in fits of rage, anger. They were beaten, they were molested, they were thrown to the streets, went on to do horrible things. So this, again, was projecting this angry mob traveller mentality. It's a very sad and also very terrifying experience for people, because the relationship, as you'll probably come across this, and you will other times, that the relationship was really, really good between particularly the west of Ireland, not so much Dublin, because Dublin was an Eastern colonial project anyway, the Pale and all that kind of stuff.
And also, Bernard, it's the criminalization of the nomadic lifestyle. When you're bringing in an anti-trespassing act and things like that. Well, wow, that really, really, what can you say? That really, really puts the icing on the cake, doesn't it? That makes things it almost really, really makes life as difficult and as tough as possible. And
this is why I maintain is that somehow or another, that the whole island of Ireland never came out of the colonial mode. Again, remember the 1922 no systems. And we're talking about systematic issues, really. So them laws are carryover from the English laws. I looked up the website of Justice Department, and they were talking about the history of it. And the first 5 years they were using as the same name, the Home Office. They were using the same administration as the English were using. So I guess in some ways that carryover has projected as that travellers as almost the last of the Irish clans, because settled people don't get persecuted if they maintain a settled life. And the whole houses and settlery wasn't really an Irish thing; it was an English thing. Fair enough, the Normans brought the monasteries, but the English brought the houses and the settlements. I'm looking at some interesting history because we talk about the relationship in 1960. It was actually the Irish travellers who did a lot of good favours for the people during the famine. Because of our nomadic lifestyle, which wasn't always nomadic, it was part of a Celtic culture, but we also had castles. It was rich people that could travel, not poor people. But back then, because of our movement and we're healthier people, we were allowed to do a lot more to help settled people, because settled people were caged into little towns without running water and so on and so forth. So when a plague or a virus came along, it almost wiped these people out. So wonderful relationship in many parts, but a very, very traumatized situation. Yeah, I do believe Ireland is still traumatized and has never talked about it. It's actually in denial of it.
I suppose, and it's inevitable that it is traumatized when you look at its history, and you know the you mentioned the famine and the great suffering and so on and so forth, and really, and the poverty that people experienced, right up until the 60s and sometimes the 70s. I guess, a post-Celtic tiger and so on and so forth. People very, very easily forget about the past, and certainly they forget about their history. And I think that the richer that people became in Ireland, they forget about their history and they forget about their people. And obviously,
I suppose, again, the whole idea to breaking down the Gaelic culture was to break down the clans, and by doing that was to break down the culture, their history, make them feel backwards, waywards. But forward that up a little bit, because we look at the Americans, Australia, New Zealand, and all these other English-speaking countries. And again, this is based on history, which is very interesting for me. Is that the Virginian company, which pretty much founded the mentality of the Americans, because it's a very business class mentality, the Americans. That company was developed here in Ireland at the expense of Irish people. The West Indies company, again, a very colonial company, was by the same people that were developing it here in Ireland. Excuse me. So there is that a linguistic connection. And if you go back into the English language is about 1,500 years old, I believe. And it's a very blunt force language. It's take, kill, sleep. Again, this is nothing against the English people. They were colonized themselves. And the English language also was chopped up from other different languages. 20% belonged to the Normans, the French, the Portuguese, and so on and so forth. So once I used to call it a Frankenstein's language because I was angry at it. I also see it now as a language of diversity, because it had different elements to it. And it could be a beautiful language. And when I say these things, I have nothing against Irish settled people, nothing against the government, nothing against the English, because the people to blame are dead 500 years. It's just nobody switched off the colonial machines, or nobody wants to talk about them or address the colonization. Let me throw back a question to you, because I know you're the author of 7 books, which is quite impressive. I'm glad you didn't offer to send the 7 books to me, because it take me forever to read them because of a lack of formal education. But if you ever come in an audiobook form, I most certainly will. But you would have also worked with the group for your Muslim background.
Yes, it did. Yes, yeah.
And if you think about this, and I have thought about it, when I was growing up, the television was projecting Native American as savages, and it was okay to shoot them. That the people from India were backwards, that the Africans were just throwing spears at each other, and the African Americans were criminals.
That's true, yes.
Afghanistan were terrorists. And it's like a real propaganda machine. And we would have experienced this ourselves. Again, when I told you about the negativity that you will find if you go looking anything about travellers, because our history and identity has been swept, but you get all the negativity. So people see that, they get fear-like anxiety. But I'm very interested also about the Muslim culture, any culture that's outside of the Western colonial world, because our similarities seem to align pretty well.
No, absolutely, absolutely, and they will. When I was writing the book about Islam, I actually, especially in today's world, Bernard, in the sense that there is so much Islamophobia and there's so much fear and hatred towards Muslims here in this country, in Britain, absolutely. I know that we've had a few terrorist attacks, but it's pretty ingrained. There are people who have a strong distrust and dislike towards Muslims. And of course, they'll be watching the news on the television, and they'll be seeing what's happening in Afghanistan. And of course, that the kind of, again, they think that all Muslims are like that, which they're not, because really only a handful of Muslims are drawn towards extreme Islamic Islamist type of jihadi type of mentality. And these are people who have misinterpreted the Quran and so on and so forth. But to the vast majority of Muslims, that concept is alien to them, and they certainly don't subscribe to that. But altogether, the Muslim community, they're kind of, they're all basically tarred with the same brush. And I suppose, in that way, you can compare it to what travelers are going through, because, if one traveler does a bad thing, that kind of almost is, it becomes representative of the whole community. Whereas, let's say if one traveler commits a serious crime, people are inclined to think that it's endemic in the traveling community. Whereas, probably the vast majority of travelers are quite law-abiding, are probably as law-abiding as other people are.
Well, yeah, but I suppose for me, when I see, again, remember I mentioned about the Native Americans being portrayed one way, Africans being portrayed another way, and everybody else were the others. They were the inferiors, and the Western mentality was the superior.
Yes. Yeah.
So when I was looking at that, I suppose we go to the Muslim. I know very little about it. I'm not archaeologist or historian, any of this kind of stuff. But there are three divisions within the Muslim world, I believe. Three different kind of practices. But if you look at the Christian one, there's 33,000 different groups, like political parties, Protestant, Presbyterians. I won't name them all out, but you get my point.
Oh.
And then the Quran,
right. So
the
many
Quran and the Bible were inspired on the Jewish faith. And no, the King of all kings was taken from the Persian king. Yeah. So the Western world, for me, you go back to Rome, it was kind of like the privateers had hijacked Christianity, and they had weaponized Jesus Christ. Because if you were to go by the teachings of Muhammad or Jesus or Hare Krishna, for that matter, any of these people, it's nothing what we see into the modern world of colonial powers, or religion was used for wars and so on and so forth. Doesn't make sense for me. So it goes by, for me, it'll always go back to colonization, because England, France, and a few of these other European countries, I think they found Machiavelli, his book, and they went bonkers with it. Because he was hell-bent on war and beating people down, and nothing like a good old war. So yeah, it goes from Rome right into your mobile phone at this stage, I think. For me, it's one continuation. It has never stopped. And the Western world is hell-bent on individualization. From day one, you go into your classroom, put your hand up, put your hand down, reward it, go into the next classroom, next school, and it's all individual success. Where outside of the Western world is far more oriented towards culture, family, and clans.
Well, so therefore, Bernard, when do you think that the tides will change? Because, help me out here. I'm writing this book, and going back to growing up in Sligo, when I grew up, when I went to primary school, national school, secondary school, I didn't know any travellers. I've left Ireland. I think I was 22 when I left, and I don't know any travellers. I've met more travellers in the last 10 to 12 months when I've been researching this book than I had ever before in my life. It's a whole new experience to me, because I didn't know any travellers in Ireland, and it's not that I grew up in a family that hated travellers or so on and so forth.
That's right.
There just weren't any around.
Well, my best
I
friend,
think with the
my
exception of
best.
one family that I knew who lived on the roadside outside Charlestown in County Mayo, I did not see or come into contact with any other traveller. And that's surprising because I think that in Sligo, from my research and in the west of Ireland, particularly, I was over in Ireland recently and I interviewed lots of travellers in Donegal. But I mean, there's quite a population of travellers in Mayo and Sligo. So I don't know where they were in the 70s and 80s, but I didn't see them. Or maybe they were there, but I didn't see them. So, as I
There
said,
a couple of,
the last year has been such a revealing experience for me. And you know, honestly, I'm really enjoying writing this book, but it's easy for me to outline the problems and the social issues that I'm coming up with. Let's, for example, Bernard, education, 90% of young people, young travellers, still don't complete secondary education. I think in one part of your introduction, you talked about health and the high mortality rates, the accommodation issues. We could talk about that for hours.
and
We've touched upon suicide. The high rates of suicide. Is it 6-7 times beyond the national average? High rates of domestic violence. LGBT issues, still a very, very touchy subject. So I can lay out all these issues, but what I want to do in this book, Bernard, is I want to kind of come up with what's the solution? How do we change this? Because let's hope that we're not sitting here in 20 years' time and still saying 90% of traveller children don't complete secondary education.
well,
Where do we break
what's
this
very
cycle? We read
interesting.
about our past. What is our future going to be like?
Well, one, nobody can live in the past. Two, nobody can live in the future. We can only live in the present. But if we don't address our past, and anyway, like if anybody walked into a specialist and they had trauma, they wouldn't put a plaster on their forehead and ask them to go ahead into the future. They would have to address what has happened in the past. Now, you've
Yes.
mentioned, which is quite interesting, is that
Yeah.
you've never learned or seen anything about travelers in the education system, where,
No.
again, I
No.
would say
No.
the reason so is because they're English education. And there's a word actually I came across lately, if I can pronounce it, and I found it in a book. I didn't find it. I found it in the book, and I got the book in a second-hand shop there about 2 years ago. But since I had met you, I picked up the book again. It was Sigmund Freud. I'm sure you've heard of him.
No, indeed, indeed, indeed. No way.
But the word was scotoma. I think it's Scototr. I'll double check. I'll send it
Yes.
to you. And I tried to Google it. I couldn't find much about it. But basically, the word in this book came from another philosopher of some kind. And it was wired to not to see what was before you. So it was like, and that brought me right back to Trinity College and all these colleges. Because if these are Irish colleges and they know history and they know the social issues, how come none of them knows where travellers came from on a very small island? And we're not an ethnic minority. We're an indigenous people. Roma, Gypsies are from India or other parts of the world.
Would that indicate that there was just zero investment into research or zero interest or both?
But see, here's the interesting part, my friend, is that we go back a little bit. All of the Irish legends, Hugh O'Donnell, the O'Neills, all these great clans, they're our people. They're our culture. But since the 1600s, the English and the plantation imperialism changed the psyche of the island and the mentality into an English one. Again, hence all the...
Bernard, why do you think the Irish education system, obviously they teach Irish history, they teach Gaelic in schools, but why couldn't they incorporate that into the curriculum for everybody about GRT history? Because it's very notably absent. And what about Gammon, the language?
Well, see,
that has been
Gammon,
totally excluded, and there's never ever been any investment in that, has there?
I'm going to maintain the course that the island and the settled mentality is a colonized mentality. It's a Western colonial construct because Ireland was never part of the Western world. It was a non-based society, similar to Japan and other parts. Irish travel culture, which stems from that culture, the Sweeneys, the Wards, the McDonald's, the O'Donnells, and we still carrying forth the same traits, the same habits, the same mentality as the people we're reading about now in the history books, which would tell us that we came from that timeline outside of the colonial world, and only up to the 1960s had the state pretty much systematically attacked us. So I would say it's a divergence of psychological differences. Now, They are teaching about Irish history, but what do they teach about Irish history? The famine, that it's dark, it's miserable. Don't go back there. It's almost like shaming them not to go into history.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. When you mentioned it, absolutely. Let's teach us all about the and then
Yeah.
that's
And you know yourself
it's
also,
quite depressing, isn't it? Yes.
you'll find many people who go through life and they come out the other side feeling that they've been cheated out of something. Like you'd
Yeah.
say a lot of people, I never taught that at school. They never taught me that, or they never showed me that. And so later in life, they might find out. So it goes back
Yeah.
again. Why do you not know? Why are the education systems not teaching people about Irish culture? I mean, it's the famine. They do they do a every so often now they do this ceremonial remembrance of what happened to the people in the famine. But we're looking at them. We're saying, look, we're literally dying on the side of roads. You're suppressing reports. There's people dying on wasteland where they've been on national radios crying out for help. The people of the famine. Are we not any different from the people? Are we not the people? And they still cannot see us. I know you're
Yeah.
an ethnic group. Now, let me just explain about the ethnic part briefly, because it's an important one. If you take African Americans, they are an ethnic minority. They were taken as a people from their motherland. So they were brought to America. Now they have no land, so they're an ethnic minority. The Native Americans are seen as an indigenous people because they came from the land. Now in Ireland, they've got the Traveller and Roma strategy plan. They have stolen our identity and they've put us in as an ethnic minority. Hence, earlier on, I told you I was told to F back to my own country by a settled person a few years ago. Because in their mind, we came from somewhere else and we had been othered for a very long time. And that was also the design of the English carried over by the 1922 unchanged systems, othered. So you
Mm.
don't see us because you were wired not to see what was before you. So in earlier on, you mentioned that your family, it's not because your family had any prejudices or issues. And we've seen this a million times. It is the truth. I grew up in Sligo, one of the greatest archaeologists now, because I'm pretty convinced with their cultures, the mentalities, but he already did. And we grew up in the same town. And we're pretty good friends now. But we grew up in the same town in different worlds, you could say. And it's not because
Yeah.
he's family had anything against travellers. He said we didn't know. They didn't tell us anything in the schools. And anything you would see was negative. So to me, you probably go bonkers eventually, me here talking about colonization. But as far as I'm concerned, the only way we can move forward if we step outside of the colonial mentality and we address it like human beings. We give
And
us the power in the
Bernard, when do you
right?
think that will happen? Because I mean, we shouldn't be in the grips of this any longer. We're a free state now and have been for a long time. When obviously, obviously, that's kind of
But
almost
yeah, free for who when you
injected
think about
into our DNA. But when are we going to clean our DNA?
I think it comes down again to just talking. Well, like I said to you, I started up a group called Vision. You can hear my alarm in the background now with my procedural law. Basically, I think with Vision, which is a group I'm trying to set up, is to look at the arts because we're not doing any blaming. We're not blaming the settled people, and we're not going to continue to live with this shame that they've been embedded into our people. That there was something wrong with us, innately wrong with us when we know that we're not. We came from great people. We are great people. So I think with the arts, we're going to address the whole nation colonization of Ireland. Because you cannot be Irish using colonial systems. You cannot be Irish using English acts and laws and literally destroying people that are Irish, are indigenous from the island. And the same practices that were used against the Irish by the English are now used today by the settled people claiming to be Irish against the Irish travellers. So for me, I
Yes.
think we'll have to get you back here, my friend, because we need to do a kind of a Dr. Phil national decolonization of the island. Did you know Dr. Phil is not a real doctor at all?
Yeah.
I was shocked when I
No.
heard that. Talk about messing with people's heads. He's a doctor, but he's not a psychiatrist. So he's not a counselor for that matter.
Yeah.
Anyway, I thought I'd throw that in there. Um, Yeah, look, I'm very interested in what you're doing. I've no doubt you're picking up an interest in learning also from the traveler side. And it's one of those things. We are psychologically messed up. We've been battered and bruised and kicked around the place for a very long time. We've been taken advantage by many, many different groups. Even today with our traveler organizations, So keep
You have, but
ejecting those.
I think what's coming across really, really strongly in my research, Bernard, and you'll be pleased to hear this, is your resilience. Your resilience is so steadfast. You guys are going nowhere. So yeah, your resilience is your key ammunition. It's your key strength, and long may it continue because
But I don't think it's
yeah,
going to last much longer, my friend, because I mean, we were riddled with suicides. Within 10 days, within Sligo and Mayo, 9 young travellers had taken their
you
lives
mentioned
in
that,
10 days. I know a
yeah,
woman who has 7 siblings that took their lives. Good friend of mine's cousin, she lost so many family members. And all of this has been suppressed. It's blended in. Oh, yeah, everybody's got issues, and we're on the same boat now. We're trying to say we're not on the same boat. And actually, in fact, we don't want to be on your boat. Give us the means and
yeah,
support, and let us show you who we are and what we can do, instead of getting us to perform. We got an 84% mainstream unemployment. 11%
yeah,
of deaths is caused by suicide. We've got a
yeah,
political death sentence of a life expectancy of 65, and barely many make it to 50. So we are resilient people. And in our history,
yeah,
actually, recorded again, we had a meeting with the Pope's advisor, Francesca something, or I think it's Francesca, it just sounds Italian. But basically, our ancestors were telling the Pope's advisor that we thought the English were barbaric, that they wanted to chop up lands, destroy the woods and forests. And then we said that their language was gobbledygook. It was a chopped up language. And nothing against the English, I swear to you. And for me, it's a bit of humor also, because uh, we understand that it's not the settled people's fault. It's not the townspeople, it's not the rural people. It's a systematic problem. And unless
yeah. Because
Dublin,
likewise, the settled people, as it were, that they were victims of that
of course,
in that sense. But yeah, but I suppose they've there is this saying, Bernard. Sometimes the bullied becomes a bully.
well, it
So
also goes into saying, my friend, the oppressed becomes the oppressors. Um,
indeed,
if
it's
you
the
take,
same.
and I've
Yeah,
seen a,
yeah,
a prime example of that. I take it as a prime example without giving any antagonization or offense to anyone. Is that if you take the Jewish community throughout the history of the Western world, long before Hitler, they had been persecuted for centuries, let alone the World War II. And then you see the situation in Israel, where that fear, where once the oppressed are now becoming the oppressors of another people. And we've
mm,
seen that, you see that in history time after time. So again, it goes back into like a Stockholm syndrome. It goes back into, yeah, it's psychological. There's no doubt about it. And what you do is in the area of psychological dealings, we're getting psychologically destroyed, despite the fact having physically strong travelers who are world champions in different sports, still
yeah.
upbeat, but psychologically we're being driven off the edges, left, right, and centre, because we are being forced into an identity that's not ours. We're told we're an ethnic group or similar to the Roma, which is nothing wrong with the Roma. They have their own wonderful culture, but they have different history and origins. So we're
Of
being
course, then entirely,
whitewashed off the
absolutely.
island, and that's
They just
psychologically
they just
killing.
think that there are some similarities in that nomadic lifestyle, but you're absolutely right. The origins and the culture and the heritage is yeah, it's so distinct, so distinct. But just going back, Bernard, I wanted to say that a couple of weeks ago with Thomas McCann from the Travelling Counselling Service about 2 weeks ago, and the service, it's not just based in Dublin, it's really expanding, Bernard. I think it's available now. They've rolled out to 15 counties in total and increasing. And I think that offers great hope that, the counselling service itself, I think Thomas said that 70% are actually self-referrals. And that's historically, and not just travellers, are not. Yeah, I think men in general, are pretty poor about talking about their feelings and going to a counsellor or
Absolutely.
whatever. I think that's across all societies and all types of people. But I think that it's encouraging that 70%, are actually self-referrals, and that's probably the best type of referral, when somebody is referring themselves rather than getting a social worker or an outreach
Absolutely.
worker to send you off.
Well, I think
I think
there's a lot to be said on that, my friend. And again, I know Thomas, wonderful human being, and I'm also involved the last 20 years where we've seen the psychological decline of Irish travellers. In other words, we're dying younger than our previous generations. self-harm and all that. My issue, I suppose, was what would we talk about? Now, I mean, it's good to talk, but if you're going into someone who may be subconsciously or consciously your oppressor, what would you talk about? If we talk about history, we get shut down. If we get talk about culture, we get shut down. So we end up talking, yeah, we're not talking to a system in some ways that does not understand us, that
Well,
could not possibly understand us in many ways. It's not
yeah.
again to take anything away from the
But I think
talking.
with the traveling counselling service, Bernard, I mean, they are culturally appropriate interventions. I mean, these are more often than not, these are by travellers themselves who have qualified as
Yeah.
counsellors.
Well,
So
for me, and I this is what gets me into so much trouble, Declan, with everyone. At a certain point, it's like if you were in a system, the psychology of the system itself, and you learn from that system, well, you'll end up seeing through the lens of that system. Um, so again, we're losing something when it comes to identities. Which one is the Irish identity? Is it the one still using all the colonial systems? Or is it the one that is from the west of Ireland, the Irish speakers, Celtic areas, Irish travellers? And isn't that really the conflict we're having? Because one,
could it not be a combination of all of them?
well, I think it should be, but we keep getting excluded. Now we're coming to a United Ireland conversation. And I think it's vitally important that at least we're a part of that, because Dublin has their own unique identity. Not many people in Ireland know this. There's a guy, Ellis, his name is. Just Google the English Pale, and he'll pop up. And he does a brilliant talk about identity and how the Irish pretty much stole. Oh, sorry, how the English stole the Irish identity and passed them off as themselves as Irish. So
Right.
that's the big historical issue for me.
So, but what's the answer? Please tell me the answer before we finish this about mental health and counselling. I mean, if you don't recommend, Bernard, that people go and see counsellors, I mean,
No, that's all. Yeah, sorry, I'm not suggesting.
how are you going to bring down those suicide rates? If it's not if people aren't talking about the issues that have caused them such great stress and trauma, I mean, what's the answer?
Well, what did it teach you in any aspect of dealing with trauma? First of all, you have to understand the trauma. You can't
Hmm.
avoid it. You can't sweep it
Hmm.
under the carpet. You can't ask somebody to live in the future and move on.
Hmm.
You have to literally go through it. You would
And
expose it one way or the other.
not just go to the GP and be pawned off with a few antidepressants or whatever, because that
Absolutely.
just masks what you're feeling.
Absolutely. But I went through many of these feelings, these emotions most of my life because, like I said, I ended up getting with conflict because I felt my way of seeing this was a bit different from everybody else's at the time. Not making myself unique in that sense, but
Yeah.
I felt it. I mean, at a very young age, you're at the back of the class. You're talking to people who project you as inferior, and you're looking at them, and they're not the most intelligent people in the world. But because they have a psychological belief of inferiority or superiority over you, they
Yeah.
feel their default more intelligent.
You're made to feel that you have that devalued identity. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so I
It's
think
horrific.
the only time we can really resolve this is when we start talking about Irish identity, what happened on the island, the colonization, the trauma, the systematic abuses, the clergy involvement because it's a colonial imperial mentality, and all
Yeah.
these aspects. They're not complex. It's something happened in the 1600s. It did not stop happening for Irish travellers. 1922 has proven that. So we're
Yeah.
really talking about let's all sit down together and talk about all our shared trauma because none of us can really move forward because we keep repeating the same things over and over.
And that's good that you said that. So Bernard, where do you think we'll be in 10 or 15 years' time? Where do you think the discussion? What do you think the main theme of the discussion will be?
I think I'm hoping in some way or another because I grew up and I've seen African Americans on TV. I could connect with that. If you had an African only bus to school and we did travel one, I could relate to that. When the Native Americans were called savages and Indians, we could relate to that. So
Yeah.
we could relate to all these other communities within a Western colonial mentality, and all the other groups are others. Now look at the Native American statistics. Look at the African American statistics. Look at the Aborigine statistics. Look at Irish travel statistics. They are all on par. So we're trying to say is that the Western colonial mentality is a colonized mentality, a trauma-filled mentality that can't help themselves because it's become systematic over 5 centuries. It's, getting on with the job, playing the role. And honestly, talk about Ireland as a beginning point, because we were the first island to be colonized by the English before the English went to the Americans and the West Indies and so on and so forth. So we know as Irish travellers, as the last standing Irish clans, is that we know our trauma, but nobody's going to want to listen to it. So I think we have a difficulty there. But arts may well change all of that. Movies, documentaries may change all that.
Yeah, but yeah, when you say people don't want to listen to it, one of the things that's coming across for me in this piece of research, Bernard, is that so many travellers don't want to speak to me, and it's not just travellers; it's across the board. So Roma and Gypsies as well.
I don't blame
the
them.
GRT community. Seriously, yeah, and the thing, and I have a good success rate, and I certainly probably have spoken to representatives from all of the communities and professionals working in all of the communities. Probably at this stage, I probably have enough to write a book. But I'll tell you this much: it has been hard slog because the door has been shut in my face more often than not. And I appreciate, I fully appreciate the reasons that there's, travellers and gypsies that have been so misrepresented in the media.
That's the only reason.
They have been so slagged off left, right, and centre. They've been so tricked and lied to, and I get all that. But for things to change, Bernard, your voice has to be heard now. It's more important that your voice is heard now than ever before.
Absolutely. Well, I'll just give you another example, my friend, about the mistrust and why travellers are so battened down and beaten down. A lot of the top musicians in Ireland had borrowed a lot of the songs of travellers. I never give them credit for it. They had taken so much from travellers for such a long time that it's like every time these settled people come to us, they come with the intention of they fixing us. But yet they cannot see their own trauma, or that they are a subculture of an English mentality, and we're not the others, we're not different, we didn't come from somewhere else. Until the settled people get that into their own heads, of course there'll be a mistrust. Now you look at some of the travel organizations, with no disrespect to them, they are ran by middle-class settled people. And the programs and the offices and everything else was designed from a settled mentality. So there's nothing in there that resembles Irish travel culture and so on and so forth. They're doing programs, but statistically and factually, over the last 50 years, worse and worse it's been getting because it's psychological. They will not give us the means for an autonomous type setup where we can explore our own language, our own culture, our own traditions. And when we say our own,
do you not think, Bernard, that if these organisations, I mean, nearly every county has one of these organisations, do you think that if these organisations didn't exist, there's the things? Well, I think a lot of things would be far worse for travellers.
How far worse would it be when you look at our statistics, my friend? Like I said to you, the physical elements.
Well, that's true. That's true. When you look, especially around accommodation, wow. That's fix that one if you're good at fixing problems. I mean, that's. Yeah. It's a huge
bit like you'll find this frustration yourself, my friend, because I've seen this over the years. It wouldn't matter if the government said, "Here's €5 billion. Here, sort it out." They do not know what to do with it because they have us all in the same program, repetitive programs. Now, you take some of these national organizations, they have middle-class settled people running them organizations for 30 and 35 years and never give up their positions of power, never even change from the chairperson. Some have private AGMs, hand-picking travellers, excluding travellers that talk up, speak out. So we're getting left, right, and centre back here.
Right, okay. Well, that's not right. Yeah.
Now, if you don't take a word from that, you look into that yourself, go to them, speak to them. And you'll also find that most of these national organisations are based in Dublin. You'll find that the travellers involved are not running them, but they are pretty much one family involved with them all. So this excludes other families, other travellers, who will not go to these people. And you'll see
you're not the collective voice, you're saying?
Yeah, there's no representation. There's no democracy.
Yeah.
We can't say we would like to elect Joe Bloggs to represent us on issues. Not happening. They're getting handpicked. And the ones that are getting handpicked are people who went into the education system. They might have a degree here and there. But again, when you weigh it all up against the statistics, the declining psychological torture of people, None of that is having a positive impact. Where we did have longer life in previous generations, we'd have physically worse, but psychologically better. Now we have it physically a little bit better, but psychologically
It's
far, far
terrible.
worse.
Yeah.
I
Oh
think we need
dear. Yeah.
conversations, my friend.
Well, what can I say? What can I say, Bernard? As I said, I'm really enjoying writing this book. I really, really hope that I kind of do some type of justice to to the subject.
I think
Yeah,
you
but
will.
it's certainly, and I certainly didn't realize it before I started doing the research. There's far more to this than meets the eye, and yeah,
That's a good. That's good. And I think because you have that innate curiosity, I don't think I'll give up too easy. It doesn't mean that we're victims all along and excuses for all our bad habits and behaviors. But when you're in an environment that is not yours and you're being hostility or the hostility being instilled into our children day in, day out, and we grew up in
it's
that
soul
state,
destroying. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it's soul destroying. We know
Because you
this.
can't be yourself. You can't live true, authentic lives. Yeah, absolutely. You're constantly scratching against the grain. Yeah.
I think we'll talk again. I have no doubt about that.
Well,
And
when
I
this
wish
book
you
comes out next year, Bernard, I'm more than willing to have another chat with you and to go through with you what I discovered and what I didn't discover, and yeah. But as I said, I'm all about solutions. It's no good just writing about a problem. And as I said, the book isn't really. It most certainly isn't to slag you guys off or to slag the GRT community. But that should be an easy book to write because
well, see,
Bernard,
we don't
I do.
mind. In some ways, we're used to it. But the
You're
time
used to
there,
it, and it'd be easy
the
for me
time,
to write you because there's plenty participants out there that I could get hold of that would give me stuff that would
yeah.
badmouth you guys.
Yeah, of course. We look at it at the same time
But
now, I think, because
yeah,
over knowledge, because we are learning more and more, is that we're going to change this tide regardless. It's unavoidable because the
yeah,
world, the Western world needs something because they're destroying the planet with their individualism and their
yeah,
colonization of
yeah,
colonial companies, so on and
yeah,
so forth. So the world needs something different. And we,
yeah,
given that we're the first people who were colonized by the English and dearly connected with the Muslims and the African communities and the various other communities around the world, because we are outside that colonial mentality. So I think we're going to change it one way or the other with the arts, with movies, with documentaries. And we're going to rescue the Irish settled. We're going to expose the settled Irish in a nice way, because they too are traumatized. I call them the Cuckoo Clan because they came from a Germanic tribe. And what they do all the world, it's called the Anglo-Saxon. Like you think about it, Anglo-Americans, Anglo-Australians, Anglo-Irish, Anglo-Chinese. Come on, these Anglos have popped into every
this is
culture.
going to be quite a revolution.
Oh no, we're done with the revolutions. I like the left, and I don't particularly too fond of the right. I'm not particularly fond of central politics either because they're all different programs operating on the same mentality. So they'll end up doing the
Yeah,
same thing over and over and over again anyway. So I don't think
yeah,
all the revolution comes in the forms of arts. Yeah, let's go. Let's do that.
yeah.
Declan, it was an absolute pleasure speaking to you, my friend.
Oh, good. I'm glad. I mean, I hope that's some use to you because God, you're a great talker yourself, Bernard. Yeah, you certainly know your stuff. You know your stuff far better than I do.
Well, it's one of those
I'm a
things.
I'm a, I'm a victim of this.
All of us are, all of us, not just travelers, settled people also. Um, English
Yeah,
are the biggest victims because, like I said
yeah,
to you, they were
yeah.
colonized themselves. The whole British English identity are two
Of
different
course,
identities.
yeah, they always look down on us, yeah, as being the uncivilized, and that's probably still in so many English people. I suppose in the last 30 or so years, it's become almost fashionable. It's almost become cool to be Irish, but it certainly wasn't that up until the 70s or 80s, even, was it?
No, you're absolutely right. But I also believe that we're going to reverse that, change that, because a lot of it, like if we go back into it, briefly, we're all meant to feel ashamed of our Irish origins, that we're aware we're them backwards. But there's nothing about the great clans, the great stories. Like the first book the English wrote was about a werewolf, where we had books about, high in literature and poetry and so on and so forth. So there are two different languages, two different mentalities. Job on it.
Do you live in Dublin now, Bernard?
No, I'm up in Dublin for a while, part of a course, but
Oh, I
basically
see.
it's down Sligo, going back up again.
Because I'm in Sligo again around the end of October, beginning of November, so we might meet up. Who knows?
Absolutely. I'll introduce you to Dylan Foley, also the archaeologist and historian. Because I think, yeah, all these conversations will add up and they'll mean something eventually, I hope.
Good. I wish you the very best to luck with it.
Likewise, my friend. Take care.
All right. Thank you very much, Bernard.
Bye.
Thanks. Take care. All the best to you. Bye-bye.